So some of you were here for the first lecture. Some of you may not have been in here for the first lecture. And so just for those of you who were not here, or maybe as a reminder for those of you who were here for that lecture, the overarching theme for the lecture series is Southern Baptists and cultural engagement. What we're going to do in the three lectures is look at three different spheres of culture. So in the first lecture, we talked about Southern Baptists and church and state, and so that was the sphere of politics. This lecture, we're going to talk about Southern Baptists and Darwinism. The sphere is science. And then tomorrow, we're going to talk about Southern Baptists and higher education, and the sphere is going to be education. So I've titled this second lecture, Southern Baptists and Darwinism, the Evolution of a Perennial Controversy. My 14-year-old son would say that's a dad joke. And maybe it is. Guilty as charged. But nevertheless, here we go. In 1859, Charles Darwin published his seminal work, The Origin of Species, followed by The Descent of Man in 1871. Now, these two books did not invent concepts such as evolutionary biology, natural selection, or human evolution, because Darwin wrote for a wider readership. Because he wrote for a wider readership, biological evolution became identified with his views, even though he was not the one who first invents them. Among those who responded negatively to these ideas, including Southern Baptists, naturalistic evolution was so linked to Darwin that the epithet Darwinism became an unfriendly synonym. That's what we do, right? When we don't like something, we make it an ism. And so it was Darwinism. So in this lecture, I want to offer a historical survey of how Southern Baptists have responded to Darwinism. I've divided the lecture into several topics that develop more or less chronologically. I argue that the consensus among Southern Baptists has always been anti-evolution, but the degree to which evolution has provoked open controversy, as well as acceptable alternatives to Darwinism, has varied at different points over the last 150 years. Evolution has always been a smoldering issue, if you will, that from time to time flares up into a brush fire, and occasionally a forest fire, some might even say sometimes a dumpster fire. How best to put the fire out remains a matter of debate among committed Southern Baptists. So I want to begin by talking about the toy controversy. While Darwin's own religious convictions remain a source of ongoing discussion and frequent controversy, there's not any scholarly consensus about that. The biographers all debate it. Scholars agree that the second edition of The Origin of Species left an opening for individuals to attempt to reconcile Darwin's theories with belief in a divine creator. Most evangelical theologians ignored this opening and rejected Darwinism. Most famously, the Princeton Seminary theologian Charles Hodge, who identified evolution with atheistic assumptions. However, a number of scientists and theologians had embraced what came to be called theistic evolution by the 1870s, affirming, if you will, the mechanics of evolution while rejecting its naturalistic teleology. Most of the theologians who were open to evolution in the USA were already affirming more liberal views of doctrines, such as the authority of Scripture, human sinfulness, and the exclusivity of Christ. So for that reason, theistic evolution became a defining feature of what came to be called modernism or liberalism in North America. Not everybody who affirmed theistic evolution was necessarily a modernist, but almost all modernists affirmed theistic evolution, if that makes sense. Not surprisingly, many of the aforementioned evolutionary brush fires in Southern Baptist life have occurred at institutions of higher education, more so than local churches. The earliest controversy was at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, which was formed in 1859, the same year Darwin published Origin of Species. Old Testament professor Crawford Toy joined the Southern Seminary faculty in 1869, following 3 years of graduate studies at the University of Berlin. In Germany, Toy was introduced to the historical critical method in biblical studies, which was a hermeneutic influenced increasingly by evolutionary concepts. Within a couple of years of his employment, rumors were circulating that Toy had not only embraced this view, but that he was actually teaching the historical critical method in the classroom, and that he had embraced biological evolution. For several years, Toy's colleagues urged him not to promote controversial views in the class, but to teach traditional understandings of Old Testament history and interpretation. They basically were urging him to take a don't ask, don't tell approach. They weren't urging him to change his views. They were saying, don't cause controversy. You sit on these views, but teach what the people want to hear. To the credit of his integrity, if not his orthodoxy, Toy ultimately refused. He honestly believed that evolution was true and that it would result in a more accurate understanding of the Old Testament, and that better interpretations of the Bible promote greater spiritual maturity among believers. Eventually, in 1879, he offered his resignation to the Southern Seminary Board of Trustees, who accepted the offer, possibly to his surprise. Toy eventually joined the faculty of Harvard University. Perhaps because of the Toy controversy, acceptance of evolution and more liberal views of Scripture would often remain closely connected in the Southern Baptist imagination. While evolutionary views were openly promoted among many Northern Baptist scholars in the period between Toy's resignation and World War I, there was little controversy among Southern Baptists, perhaps because relatively few Southern Baptist professors embraced evolution, at least openly. By the 1920s, however, there was open conflict among Baptists in the South, largely because of the influence of fundamentalism in general and Southern Baptist fundamentalist J. Frank Norris in particular. Historian James Thompson argues in his study of SBC controversies in the 1920s that the evolution debates were characterized by extremism, such that it was difficult to distinguish between the anti-evolution sentiments of Southern Baptist fundamentalists and non-fundamentalists. What he means is that nearly all Southern Baptists were theological conservatives, whether they owned the label fundamentalist or not. And almost all of them rejected Darwinism, which he sees as being kind of an extreme right-wing view. Numerous Baptist state papers published editorials in the 1920s about the dangers of evolution. These pieces routinely identified Darwinism with unbelief, claimed evolution undermined biblical inspiration and authority, and warned that the social implications of Darwinism opened the door to moral disaster. Editors also suggested regularly that evolution was an unproven theory and that it was incompatible with time-honored scientific principles. Historian Jeffrey Moran notes this latter critique was common among anti-evolutionists who argued that authentic science must be rooted in empiricism rather than the hypothetical deductive method of Darwin. This remains a critique of evolution among contemporary creationists, especially at the more popular level. In the period under consideration, while what we might call moderate creationists attempted to critique the assumptions and implications of evolution without necessarily embracing more literal interpretations of the Genesis account, most Southern Baptists were literalists. And they were very suspicious of any sort of figural interpretations of Genesis 1 through 11 or other passages in Scripture that speak to origins. Frank Norris is one of the most colorful and controversial figures in Southern Baptist history. We don't have time to even scratch the surface when it comes to Norris and his peculiarities. For our purposes, it's enough to note Norris was a fundamentalist crusader who, like his Northern Baptist counterparts, William Bell Riley and John Roach Stratton, closely tied evolution to unbelief, despite the claims of theistic evolutions to the contrary. Through much of the 1920s, Norris was on the hunt for signs of evolution in Southern Baptist institutions, at the same time that states were passing the sorts of anti-evolution laws that eventually led to the Scopes trial in 1925. Norris went after evolutionists in his home state of Texas. He addressed the Texas state legislature calling for a law outlawing the teaching of evolution in the state's public schools. He also accused Southwestern Seminary historian W.W. Barnes of being an evolutionist, though that accusation gained little traction. Norris lost that battle, but he was more successful in his agitations against Baptist-related Baylor University in Waco. Joseph Dawson, longtime pastor of First Baptist Waco, who we mentioned in the last lecture, and a close supporter of Baylor, was a known theistic evolutionist, and many Baylor faculty and students were members of First Baptist Waco. This may have created some suspicion about Baylor's orthodoxy on this issue. Either way, Norris pressed successfully for the removal of Baylor sociologist Grover Samuel Dow from the faculty in 1921 because of Dow's theistic evolutionary beliefs, which Dow had affirmed in a published textbook on sociology. He was in print on the issue. A few years later, in 1925, Baylor zoologist O.C. Bradbury resigned because of his own theistic evolutionary beliefs. Anti-evolutionists also scored other victories against evolutionary scholars in the 1920s. Let me give you a couple of more examples. In 1924, Henry Fox was forced out as a professor of biology from Mercer University. Now, the Fox case was relatively uncontroversial among Georgia Baptists because during the course of the investigation, Fox refused to affirm the full deity of Christ or the virgin birth. So Fox was clearly a modernist, regardless of what he thought about evolution, so it became pretty non-controversial. But 2 years later, biologist Andrew Lee Pickens was fired from Furman University for affirming evolution in a newspaper article. Pickens, in turn, went to work for the state of California, where he became America's leading expert on termites. Guess what I'm going to do when I grow up, Mommy? While Norris had been effectively sidelined from Southern Baptist life by the mid-1920s, other fundamentalists pushed for an anti-evolution confessional statement at the 1925 annual meeting of the Southern Baptist Convention. E.Y. Mullins was president of Southern Seminary at the time, and he had positioned Southern as a moderately creationist institution that opposed evolution but did not explicitly affirm what was being called increasingly a literal interpretation of Genesis 1 through 11. There was some latitude about how to interpret it. For example, Southern Seminary missiologist W.O. Carver wrote throughout the 1920s about the need to find a middle ground between theistic evolution and literalism, which drew the scorn of anti-evolutionists who believed he had conceded too much ground to the modernists. Notably, Mullins also chaired the committee that drafted the Baptist Faith and Message in 1925. The confession was adopted without any reference to evolution, which infuriated convention fundamentalists, including his fellow committee member C.P. Staley, the fundamentalist editor of the Oklahoma Baptist Messenger. Staley led Oklahoma Baptists to withhold giving to Southern Seminary because of concerns that Mullins was too friendly to theistic evolution, even though Mullins himself explicitly rejected that position. Nevertheless, Kentucky Baptist fundamentalists spread rumors of the seminary's heterodoxy when it came to creation. At the 1926 SBC annual meeting, President George McDaniel affirmed a traditional view of creation in his opening address. Fundamentalists managed successfully to have the convention pass a resolution endorsing the McDaniel statement and called upon all SBC institutions and boards to affirm McDaniel's position. Mullins obliged, and the anti-evolutionist criticisms of him and Southern waned. One evolutionary controversy during this period was an interesting outlier because it resulted in a completely different outcome than the others. William Lewis Poteet taught natural science for 47 years at Wake Forest College, the last 22 of which he was also the school's president. Poteet was part of a prominent family of Baptist educators. His sister Ida was an art professor at Meredith College in Raleigh. His brother, Edwin McNeil Poteet Sr., was president of Furman University in Greenville, and his nephew, Edwin McNeil Poteet Jr., served as president of Colgate Rochester Divinity School in New York. The Poteet men, in particular, were all outspoken modernists and champions of a Southern Baptist version of the social gospel. According to his biographer, William Lewis Poteet, quote, closely followed the developments of modern biology and was exceptionally frank in teaching evolution. By 1922, Poteet's views had become widely known among Baptists in the South, and he attempted to make the case for theistic evolution in the pages of the North Carolina Baptist periodical, The Biblical Recorder. In subsequent articles, Poteet applied the Baptist principle of liberty of conscience to the question of academic freedom, arguing that Baptist scholars should be free to reconcile scientific findings with their Christian faith. At the 1922 annual meeting of the Baptist State Convention of North Carolina, Poteet preached a widely praised sermon that temporarily deflected criticism from his evolutionary beliefs. Poteet subsequently survived further attempts to remove him during the height of the fundamentalist modernist controversies in the 1920s, largely because of his oratorical skills and his respect as a denominational statesman in North Carolina. Poteet was also protected by his friend and fellow theistic evolutionist Richard Vann, the former president of Meredith College, who was now the executive secretary of the Education Board in the Baptist State Convention. As an aside, I don't know that this happens often with seminary presidents. I would like to think it doesn't. But anytime college presidents stand up at state conventions and they preach barn burner sermons and talk about how many students got saved on campus, and they don't say anything about orthodoxy or the biblical worldview, your red flag should go up that they're beginning to drift. That's exactly what Poteet did in the 1920s. So let's talk a little bit about what I'm calling the quiet years. The period from about 1930 to 1960 could be considered the quiet years when it comes to Baptist debates about evolution. There were no significant controversies related to this topic. That said, let me share with you a frustrating truth about historians. There are some things that we are 98% sure about based upon anecdotal and circumstantial evidence, but can't actually demonstrate conclusively with an unimpeachable paper trail. I argue this phenomenon applies to the topic at hand. I think there are lots of solid hints that evolution was on the rise in SBC institutions in the 1960s, even though it's difficult to document that by things that are in print or by controversies that arose because of it. So let me give you a few examples of the anecdotal and circumstantial evidence that I think supports this hypothesis. First of all, historically in Southern Baptist life, theistic evolution was rarely a belief embraced in isolation from other more revisionist views, especially progressive accounts of biblical inspiration and authority. We know for certain that after World War II especially, large numbers of Baptist scholars and seminary-educated pastors embraced progressive views of Scripture. So it seems reasonable to assume that many of them also embraced theistic evolution. Second, when evolution began to become a hot topic again in the 1960s, a number of theologians published works that seemed to be at least sympathetic to theistic evolution. Many of them had begun their careers in the period right after World War II, so it seems reasonable that they probably had held those views for the couple of decades before they started writing. A final line of anecdotal evidence is that fundamentalist critics of the SBC, such as John R. Rice and various personalities associated with institutions like Bob Jones University, routinely accused Baptist-related colleges especially of harboring evolutionists. Now, fundamentalists were far from neutral observers, and at times they were prone to overstatement. But they also had a knack for noticing smoke in the SBC that was sometimes evidence of an actual fire. So it seems likely that these years were quiet on account of the low profile taken by Southern Baptist evolutionists, rather than the absence of evolution among the Southern Baptist scholarly class, if you will. While Southern Baptists and most other evangelicals were anti-evolution during the first half of the 20th century, there was no consensus at the time about the age of the earth or which elements in Genesis might be literal and which might be potentially figurative. Some creationists argued for a literal six-day creation and dated the Earth's age at somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years. This view, which would come to be called young Earth creationism, enjoyed an ancient pedigree among Christian thinkers, but had become popular with many English-speaking Protestants since the Irish theologian James Ussher proposed his famous chronology in the 1650s. When anti-evolutionists speak of a literal view of creation, they normally mean that as a synonym for young Earth creationism. Other creationists argued for a literal six-day creation, but they posited a significant gap of time between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2 that allowed for a much older age of the earth. There were several varieties of old Earth creationism as well, but two were popular in the mid-20th century. Gap creationism was especially popular among dispensationalists because it was promoted in the study notes of the first edition of the Scofield Reference Bible. Still, other creationists were non-literalists who argued that the days in Genesis represented larger periods of time and that the earth was much older than 10,000 years, though they rejected evolution. Day-age creationism was popular with some of the leading anti-evolutionists during the fundamentalist modernist controversies, including William Jennings Bryan and William Bell Riley. Young Earth, gap, and day-age versions of creationism were all found among evangelicals, including Southern Baptists, during the post-war era. In 1961, however, young Earth creationism received a significant boost in popularity with the publication of The Genesis Flood, co-authored by John Whitcomb and Henry Morris. The Genesis Flood defended a young Earth chronology by arguing that the flood of Genesis 6 through 8 was a global event that resulted in various phenomena that give the appearance that the earth is very old. Whitcomb, who passed away just a couple of years ago, was an evangelical theologian in the Grace Brethren tradition. Morris was the head of the civil engineering department at Virginia Tech University, and at the time the Genesis Flood was written, he was a Southern Baptist layman. Now, Morris would eventually leave his Southern Baptist church and start an independent Baptist church because he and his pastor disagreed about the age of the earth. But again, when the Genesis Flood was published, one of the co-authors was a Southern Baptist. The Genesis Flood was intended to be a response to Bernard Ramm's 1954 book, The Christian View of Science and Scripture. Ramm was a Baptist theologian who was on the faculty of Baylor University at the time of that book's publication. He was an old Earth creationist who did not defend any particular view in his book, but rather presented several different interpretive options. However, Ramm dismissed the young Earth view and flood geology as being incompatible with modern science. Ramm was a member of the evangelical scholarly organization, the American Scientific Affiliation, and his views sort of became baseline in that group. Old Earth creationism, skepticism about young Earth creationism. Though Ramm rejected theistic evolution, he didn't affirm it. Many creationists were convinced that Ramm's views were opening the door for theistic evolution to gain traction among evangelical theologians and scientists. Basically, what begins to happen is young Earth creationists begin to argue that old Earth creationism is a halfway house in between orthodoxy and heterodoxy. Heterodoxy being theistic evolution. Moving beyond theistic evolution, you begin to move even further away than simply heterodoxy. But let's talk about the Genesis controversies in the SBC. Within the Southern Baptist Convention itself, evolution was at least tangentially connected to two controversies over Genesis in the 1960s. In 1961, Midwestern Seminary professor Ralph Elliott published a book titled The Message of Genesis. He embraced the historical critical method and advanced a non-literal interpretation of Genesis 1 through 11 that convention conservatives believed undermined biblical inspiration and authority. Elliott's book was dropped by the Baptist Sunday School Board when the first printing sold out, and Elliott himself was terminated from Midwestern Seminary in 1962 because he refused to promise that he would not seek another publisher for the book. The convention responded to the Eliot controversy by adopting the 1963 Baptist Faith and Message. In 1969, the Broadman Bible Commentary published its volume on Genesis, which was written by a British Baptist scholar. Like the Message of Genesis, the new commentary adopted a non-literal interpretation of Genesis 1 through 11. The convention voted to pull the commentary and ordered a revised edition by a different author. As I noted before, in Southern Baptist circles, affirmation of higher criticism of the Old Testament and evolution were closely connected in the denominational imagination. While neither Eliot nor the Broadman volume explicitly affirmed evolution, it was reasonable to be concerned these volumes were at least potentially opening the door for the acceptance of evolution among Southern Baptists. Thus, it's not surprising that in 1969, W.A. Criswell published a book titled Why I Preach the Bible is Literally True while serving as president of the Southern Baptist Convention. Criswell denounced evolution as incompatible with Scripture and suggested that a high view of Scripture necessitated a literal interpretation of Genesis. Harold Lindsell, a former editor of Christianity Today and a Southern Baptist church member, also connected a literal view of Genesis with biblical inerrancy in his 1976 book, The Battle for the Bible. For both of these men, a literal interpretation led naturally to the young earth position. This is exactly the argument creation scientists were beginning to make during this same period. Biblical inerrancy virtually necessitates a literal interpretation of Genesis and an age of the earth that is probably less than 10,000 years. Henry Morris helped form the Creation Research Society in 1963. In 1970, the Creation Research Society published a young earth creationist textbook that was used primarily in Christian private schools, though a handful of public school districts also adopted the book. More significantly, in 1972, Henry Morris split from that organization to form the Institute for Creation Research, an apologetics ministry that would experience considerable controversy in the 80s and 90s because of their attempts to offer graduate level degrees in science, even though they weren't connected to an academic institution. In 1980, the Creation Science Foundation was formed in Australia, but that's not the name you know it by. When the ministry opened an American branch in 1994, it rebranded as Answers in Genesis. Answers in Genesis is arguably the most influential young earth creationist organization today. In recent years, their Creation Museum and the Ark Encounter have remained extremely popular among evangelicals and an ongoing source of frustration in the secular media. Creation science organizations played a significant role in establishing young earth creationism as the dominant form of creationism, at least at the popular level, largely through their influence upon private Christian schools, and by the 1980s, the Christian homeschool movement. Evangelical congregations, including many Southern Baptist churches, began establishing private Christian schools in large numbers in the 1960s. While most of the earliest private Christian schools in the South were what we would today call segregation academies that were formed in response to the forced desegregation of public schools, by the mid-1970s, race was far less of a driving force in the continued proliferation of these schools. Rather, concerns about the growing secularist bias of public schools was at the forefront of the Christian school movement. Teacher-led prayer and Bible reading had been excised from the public schools. We talked about that in the last lecture. Sex education courses were becoming commonplace, and many history textbooks seemed to evangelicals and other conservatives to be more critical and less patriotic than had once been the case. But most significant for our purposes, naturalistic evolution had become almost universally accepted in public school science textbooks by the 1970s. Most evangelical parents opted to leave their children in public schools. So not surprisingly, school boards all over the country experienced debates over textbooks, including science textbooks. In fact, this was one of the early galvanizing movements that contributed to the rise of the religious right. In the 1970s, Mel and Norma Gabler, not sure how to pronounce that, emerged as the public face of the fight for conservative textbooks. The Gablers were Southern Baptist laypeople who wanted all public schools in Texas to reflect the ostensibly conservative and religious values of their constituencies, including treating naturalistic evolution as a theory rather than a settled scientific fact. For many conservative evangelicals, evolution was foundational to the secular humanist worldview. So defending young earth creationism was defending the biblical worldview itself. As an aside, my late father-in-law was a Southern Baptist minister, pastor. He was a homeschooling parent. And when I started dating the young woman who is now my wife, I noticed there was a poster that they had up in their house, and the poster was about the castle of secular humanism, and the foundation of the castle was Darwinism. So it's that idea that it's foundational to an anti-biblical worldview. Southern Baptist politicians could be found on both sides of the emerging textbook wars. President Jimmy Carter, a Southern Baptist Sunday school teacher, created the Department of Education in 1980, which textbook activists viewed with considerable suspicion. On the other side, North Carolina Senator Jesse Helms, he's the gentleman in the picture there with Ronald Reagan, another Southern Baptist Sunday school teacher, unsuccessfully agitated for the GOP to add opposition to federal funding for controversial textbooks to the party's platform in 1976. As the conservative resurgence began in the Southern Baptist Convention in 1979, the Republican Party was undergoing its own conservative resurgence, in part through the influence of the religious right. That's Jerry Falwell and Ronald Reagan together. Now, with some fear and trembling, I'm going to venture what some might consider to be a controversial statement, though I am not trying to be controversial. I've long believed it is impossible to understand the history of the SBC between 1979 and 2000 without also understanding the history of the religious right during the same era. Southern Baptists have almost always been closely connected to political conservatism, at least for most of the 20th century. However, it has been conceived that is political conservatism at any given moment in history. And the fortunes of the convention and the fortunes of political conservatism have often been intertwined, at least circumstantially, if not causally. I think internal Southern Baptist debates since the 2016 election have only confirmed we are closely tied to political conservatism. But that's another topic for another day, no matter how much Dr. Land wants me to talk about it right now. For our purposes, it's enough to note that a publicly engaged form of anti-Darwinism became closely identified with the religious right, which means it was also closely identified with Southern Baptist movement conservatism. Again, not arguing causation, but I think there's some correlation there. Leaders in the religious right, including some who were or who became Southern Baptists, often tied acceptance of natural evolution with the inevitability of moral decline in America. Jerry Falwell was the most public leader in the religious right. He was a confidant of many leading Southern Baptist pastors, and he became a Southern Baptist pastor in the 1990s. He made this argument against evolution regularly during the 80s and the 90s. Another example is Ed McAteer, a layman who convened the Religious Roundtable and was a member of Bellevue Baptist Church in Memphis, Tennessee, where Adrian Rogers was pastor. McAteer admitted that he and many of his compatriots in the religious right actually wanted to outlaw evolution, but since that was not feasible at the time, the strategy instead was to argue that evolution and creation should be taught side by side in the classroom and may the best man win. Pat Robertson and James Robeson are two other examples, though both of them embraced the charismatic movement and eventually drifted away from Southern Baptist life during the 1980s. Robertson founded the Christian Broadcasting Network, ran unsuccessfully for the GOP presidential nomination in 1988, later formed the Christian Coalition, and has said all kinds of crazy stuff on television. Robeson hosted the National Affairs briefing in 1980 where Ronald Reagan famously endorsed evangelicalism. You can endorse me, but I want you to know that I endorse you. Not surprisingly, since the religious right was concerned about the influence of naturalistic evolution, the increasingly conservative Southern Baptist Convention was as well. In 1980, the SBC passed a resolution that affirmed a literal understanding of creation as recorded in the Bible. 2 years later, the convention went further with a resolution affirming scientific creationism as a viable alternative to evolution that should be taught alongside evolution as an alternate theory in public school classrooms. A 1984 resolution against secular humanism, that's the one on the screen, explicitly tied secularism to widespread acceptance of creation as a myth and evolution as a scientific fact. Again, implicit in these statements to varying degrees is the belief that creationism means young earth creationism. A commitment to a literal view of creation was part of the conservative litmus test during the 80s and 90s. Nancy Ammerman discusses this topic in her seminal study, Baptist Battles. She notes that Adrian Rogers and W.A. Criswell were on the record affirming a literal view of creation. She also recounts a conversation with a conservative messenger who planned to support Adrian Rogers at the 1986 SBC annual meeting. When pressed by Ammerman, his rationale was that he had read a magazine article claiming that evolution was being taught in Baptist schools. In his recent study of creationism, Christopher Turney also provides documentary evidence that SBC presidents Bailey Smith, Jimmy Draper, and Charles Stanley denounced evolution and affirmed a literal creation, tying belief in the latter, a literal creation, to an affirmation of biblical inerrancy. SBC President Jerry Vines even published a book-length defense of young earth creationism. As with the religious right more generally, these Baptist leaders equated affirmation of Darwinism with the slide toward moral declension in the culture. By the early 21st century, some Southern Baptist scholars were also promoting young earth creationism as the biblical position, especially, though not exclusively, at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Albert Mohler began writing and speaking periodically in defense of the young earth position in the mid-2000s. His popularity as an internet essayist and public speaker have positioned him as a leading theological ally of scientific creationists. Russell Moore, who served as Southern's chief academic officer from 2004 to 2013, also came out in favor of young earth creationism in the mid-2000s. For Moore, this was an intellectual conversion from old earth creationism, similar to the views held by earlier evangelical Baptist theologians Bernard Ramm and Carl Henry. Kurt Wise, a Southern Baptist paleontologist, also emerged during this period as one of the leading defenders of young earth creationism. From 2006 to 2009, Wise directed Southern's Center for Theology and Science before becoming director of Truett McConnell College's Creation Research Center. Greg Allison, who has taught at Southern Seminary since 2003, has written for the Young Earth Creationist Ministry Answers in Genesis and has contributed to a collection of essays critiquing theistic evolution. But the 1990s also witnessed a new entry in the anti-Darwinist movement with the rise of intelligent design. Intelligent design has ancient roots, but in its modern form, it's a collection of philosophical and scientific critiques of naturalistic evolution that rely upon evidence and natural revelation rather than special revelation. As such, it's best to think of intelligent design as compatible with theism, and that would include Christian theism, but as not technically necessitating theism. Most folks who believe in intelligent design are Christians, but not everybody who believes in intelligent design would be a Christian. For this reason, young earth creationists who are driven primarily by their interpretation of Genesis 1 and 2 are sometimes critical of intelligent design for being insufficiently Judeo-Christian in its views. While intelligent design became a topic of conversation among scientists in the 1980s, it was the lawyer Philip Johnson's 1991 book, Darwin on Trial, that brought the conversation into evangelical circles. Other seminal works in that movement followed, notably biochemist Michael Behe's Darwin's Black Box and mathematician and philosopher William Dembski's The Design Inference. Dembski later taught at both Southern Seminary and Southwestern Seminary, though his rejection of young earth creationism proved controversial, as we'll discuss in a bit. The Discovery Institute, founded in 1990, became the most prominent think tank committed to the promotion of intelligent design. Intelligent design was certainly not accepted by all conservative Christians, but even many who preferred the young earth view biblically recognized the apologetical value of intelligent design critiques of Darwinism. By the late 1990s, school boards that had once debated whether or not scientific creationism could be taught alongside naturalistic evolution were experiencing controversy over whether or not intelligent design should be taught in public school science classes. For their part, evolutionists persistently argued that intelligent design was really a Trojan horse for creationism. And to be fair, sometimes intelligent design proponents lent credibility to that concern, as was the case with the so-called wedge document that the Discovery Institute published internally in 1998. That internal manifesto, which was intended to be secret, discussed how intelligent design could be used as a strategy to advance the Christian worldview in the public square. When the document was leaked, devotees of naturalistic evolution felt like their fears had been confirmed. One of the individuals most responsible for popularizing intelligent design was Charles Colson, a former Nixon administration aide who had become a Christian in the wake of the Watergate scandal. Colson founded the ministry Prison Fellowship in 1976, but by the 1990s he had emerged as one of the leading proponents of Christian worldview thinking. Colson was also a Southern Baptist layman. Colson and his frequent co-author Nancy Pearcey, a fellow at the Discovery Institute, promoted the work of intelligent design scholars in their books on Christian worldview. As a personal aside, while I had heard of intelligent design and knew vaguely of the movement in the 1990s, mid-1990s, it was reading Colson's 1998 book, How Now Shall We Live, that introduced me to intelligent design more carefully and led me to read several books written by scholars in that movement in the late 90s and early 2000s. In many ways, Colson was my gateway into various ways of thinking, but he was my gateway into this conversation as well. Not all Southern Baptist critics of Darwinism affirmed young earth creationism or identified officially with the intelligent design movement. The apologists John Ankerberg and John Weldon published a number of books that critiqued Darwinian evolution but affirmed old earth creationism. Like their sometime collaborator, the astrophysicist Hugh Ross, Ankerberg and Weldon affirmed a version of the day-age theory that they called progressive creationism. Ankerberg is a member of a Southern Baptist church in Chattanooga, and Weldon, though not strictly Southern Baptist anymore, earned some of his degrees from Southern Baptist schools. Philosopher William Lane Craig has written in defense of the Kalam cosmological argument, which was originally put forward by medieval Islamic philosophers. Craig suggests that Kalam is compatible with both Christian cosmological arguments and scientific theories such as the Big Bang. Craig is a member of a Southern Baptist church in Metro Atlanta. Two Southern Baptist scholars, theologian Harry Lee Poe and chemist Jimmy Davis, have collaborated on 3 books related to science and faith. They write from an old earth creationist perspective, though the topics they engage include many scientific questions beyond just the question of origins. More recently, a number of Southern Baptist scholars who are at least open to old earth creationism participated in a series of discussions with scholars from Hugh Ross's organization Reasons to Believe and the BioLogos Foundation, a theistic evolutionary organization. The latter has played a key role in arguing against universal common descent based upon the findings of the Human Genome Project, a position that many theologians, I think accurately, argue undermines the historicity of Adam and Eve. Those discussions resulted in the 2017 book, Old Earth or Evolutionary Creation, discussing origins with Reasons to Believe and BioLogos. The Southern Baptist theologians functioned as the moderators between Reasons to Believe and BioLogos. Southern Baptist theologian Ken Keithley co-edited that volume. Other Southern Baptist contributors included Robert Stewart, Steve Lemke, Ted Cable, Jamie Dew, and John Lang. At times, old earth creationism has provoked controversy among Southern Baptists. In 2009, William Dembski wrote a book titled The End of Christianity while serving as a research professor at this institution. The book sparked a controversy here for its speculation that the Genesis flood was local to the Middle East rather than a global phenomenon. This controversy was perhaps further inflamed because one of the biggest critics of Dembski's views, the church historian Tom Nettles, was on faculty at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Never underestimate the role of interinstitutional rivalries and theological debates in the SBC. Dembski eventually resigned from Southwestern in 2012 and later admitted he had finessed his views about the flood when questioned by the seminary's administration so that he could keep his job. In this lecture, I've sought to offer something like a grand narrative of Southern Baptist responses to Darwinism. Historically, Southern Baptists have run the gamut from theistic evolutionists to young earth creationists, with most folks tilted decidedly toward the latter. At times, Southern Baptists have experienced significant controversy over evolution, though most of the time the issue has been more of a friendly discussion among committed anti-Darwinists about the finer points of creationism. At present, the Southern Baptist Theological Academy includes both young earth and old earth creationists, probably with a few theistic evolutionists who keep their heads down low and smile a lot. It's somewhat harder to gauge the diversity of views among scientists who teach at Baptist-related colleges and universities, but there are at least some schools that require all of their faculty to adhere to the young earth view. Truett McConnell and Bruton Parker College are two examples. Some that allow for both young earth and various types of old earth creationists. My own institution, North Greenville University, takes that position. And some that are even comfortable in employing professors who have a high view of Scripture but affirm theistic evolution. Union University and Baylor would be examples of those. While the Southern Baptist grassroots probably gravitate more toward young earth creationism, it's clear that there's not a scholarly consensus among Southern Baptist theologians, philosophers, and scientists. We need to be willing to admit that all of these positions cannot be right, and indeed, it is at least theoretically possible all of them might be wrong. Furthermore, every institution should be free to establish its own boundaries when it comes to these matters, so long as it does so in accountability to whatever Baptist body it's responsible to, whether that's the Southern Baptist Convention or a state Baptist convention. Nevertheless, I'm hopeful that Southern Baptist life in general will be evidenced by a hospitable orthodoxy on this issue that allows a place at the table for any scholar who claims Jesus is Lord, adheres to a high view of Scripture, rejects naturalistic explanations for the origins of creation, and unhesitatingly affirms belief in God the Father Almighty, the maker of heaven and earth. Thank you very much.